Yes, hello. Good morning, good evening. This is Rolf Schneiderwald from Cologne. Warm welcome. We thought that it is a good idea that the guy with the poorest English is going to start this meeting to encourage everyone who is not so familiar with English, and also to remind our native speaker to speak slowly and easy, simple sentences. I'm a facilitator for large groups and change projects, also for democracy projects. And it was 1 year ago that I received the first impulse to look for another ways to tackle polarization and conflicts. It was during the Beyond the Basic training in Leicester, UK. And there were several conversations with other Europeans about the situation in Europe, and we agreed about the need for a new kind of dialogues. And now we have 1 year later, and we are facing a situation in Europe, in many countries of Europe, and I guess also in the United States and other countries, with increased polarization and more conflicts than ever. And the question, how can we tackle this polarization and the conflicts? And how can I be an instrument of a new kind to overcome this? Is my leading call for the invitation for the first Worldview Intelligence program in Europe, and also for the invitation today. What will happen today? After a technical note, small technical note and a check-in, Jerry and Casey will give us an introduction of the Worldview Intelligence program. It will last around 30 minutes. And we invite you to come in with your questions, and you can do it in 2 different ways. The first one is that you use the chat module. I will show you directly how it works. And you have time to ask it directly to Jerry and Casey after the presentation. But if you see, if questions appears during the presentation, we invite you to write questions in the chat. And Nancy and I am trying to cluster the questions so that we have a good harvest. And we will also answer the questions which we can't cover today after this meeting, so that we hope that all questions are answered at the end. Yes. And I like to show you now how it works with the chat. At first, I hope you can see at the bottom of this window, if you move your mouse, there's a button, the chat, and if you click there, it will open a column at the right or at the bottom, and you can type in your questions or what is important for you there, and if you return, your text will appear for everyone. So we think this meeting will last for around about 1 hour, and after the presentation, after time for the questions, we have a small checkout, and we hope that you enjoy it.
So we want to also have this be somewhat participative because we are participative people. And we'd like to start with a written check-in from everyone. So as Rolf has just instructed, if you would type into your chat box your name, where you are now, where you're sitting, your occupation, and then what brought you to this call. So we'll see those line up. And by the way, we will be harvesting everything. So you'll be able to see when everything is said and done, who attended this call, where they are sitting now, their occupation, and what it is that brought them to this call. Thank you. Okay, those can continue to come in, and I think with that, we will pass the talking piece to Kathy and Jerry.
Yes.
And could I invite, someone suggested, if you could turn off your microphones, that would allow for background noise to be kept at bay. Thank you.
There, so I've just shared my screen, I think. Welcome to this first international forum for Worldview and Worldview Intelligence. And Jerry and I are very excited to be here with you today and to be able to share a little bit about Worldview and Worldview Intelligence to whet your appetite or spark some curiosity. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about worldviews and what they are. And then Jerry's going to come in and talk about the framework that we've been using and the dimensions of worldview that we've been working with over the last couple of years.
So Kathy, we don't see your screen.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Yeah, I do.
Or I don't.
I don't, so I can see it.
Okay. Rolf, maybe you'll need to.
Now it's coming. Yes.
There we go. Okay. Good. That makes me happy. Now I can see the screen and I can see people's pictures. So with the worldview, we ask this question, what is the lens through which you view the world? Because we see the world the way we are, not the way the world is, but we make assumptions that we all see the world in the same way, or many people make those assumptions. This word, worldview, has a lot in it, and we have certainly been noticing that it's showing up in all kinds of places and in all kinds of ways where people are making assumptions about individuals or organizations or even countries about what their whole worldview might be based on one comment or one article or one exposure to the way that they think or they might think. And even though we use the word a lot or the word is in common use, we all think we know what it means, but we don't have a good definition or a good understanding of what it means. And so when we've been asking people the question, what is your worldview and how do you know? Most people don't have an easy way to answer that question. But we also ask questions like, what has influenced your worldview? And how does your worldview impact your communication and your relationships? You know, what are you willing to defend? And why are you willing to defend it? What are you defending automatically without thinking about it? And why does that happen? And what information does your worldview filter in or filter out? And we don't easily know the answers to these questions because most of our worldview is operating underneath of the surface. About 80% or more is in our unawareness, even though it influences our relationships and our communication. And it is whenever we are experiencing conflict or tension, often some aspect of our worldview is at the heart of that. And so as we've been working with worldviews and growing our understanding about it, one of the things that we know is that, you know, a worldview is a common concept of reality, and it's worldviews are locally constructed and they're socially constructed, so that we're not born with a worldview, but we are born into a worldview because our families have worldviews, our communities have worldviews, our faith institutions have worldviews, our schools have worldviews. And so before we know it, we are being socialized into various worldviews because that is how we come to cope in society, how we come to survive, really, because we learn early on what is acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable behavior. And some people might question that early on in their lives, and other people might not question it till later. A worldview provides the answers to life's big questions, and we base our thoughts and our predictions about the future based on and through our worldview. They contain all of our hopes and dreams, and not only do we as individuals hold worldviews, but our organizations hold worldviews, our social systems, our communities, and even our countries. We talk about a worldview, but typically for all of us, because we are multidimensional beings, we hold many worldviews, most of which are overlapping, but some of which might actually be in conflict with each other, certainly within us individually. When we look at our families or our communities or our organizations, we're more likely to run into worldviews that have a shared component, but also might have components of difference. One of the, our worldviews also come from our life experiences. And so as we grow and as we travel or as we work or various things happen to us, our worldviews might grow and expand. So we have all had experiences of our worldview shifting or changing or expanding, but most of us haven't thought about it in exactly that way. One of the reasons that we mention this is because we can become very attached to our worldviews, and we don't always remember that we are beings who are shifting and growing all of the time anyway. And just a couple more things about worldviews before I hand it over to Jerry. One is that our worldview is part of our identity, or our identity is part of our worldview. And when our worldview becomes challenged, it's as if our very identity is being challenged. And so a typical response to having our worldview challenged is to want to defend our own worldview or our own point of view, to dismiss somebody else's point of view, or sometimes we want to normalize the experience by looking for how we're all the same, or to make statements about what we all have in common instead of to recognize the difference that might exist within our worldview. There is research that indicates when our worldview is challenged, if it's really challenged, because we will respond to it in the same way as if our very life is challenged, which is why when we begin to feel challenged or challenge someone else, we move into the territory of debate or argument rather than the territory of exploration, because it's like we're defending our very life. And I think the only other thing that I'll say about worldview before we move into the framework is that we've been noticing in the worldview work that when we can find points of connection, that we can explore difference from a very different place. But when we start with difference, we amplify difference, and then it's really hard to find the exploratory ground, to be in conversation with each other in a way that asks us to become aware of both our own worldview and the worldview that somebody else has, so that we can build on that or draw on that to find some of the best ways forward on issues that matter to us or on situations where we are experiencing challenges or difficulty. So Jerry, on that, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Kathy, and greetings, everyone. So when we began exploring worldviews, we really began exploring it during Art of Hosting trainings. And in Art of Hosting, we often say there are two worldviews, a mechanistic and a living system worldview. And we began to find that is not fully satisfactory in our explorations. And so we wanted to look for other ways to talk about worldview and express it. And we began with a simple graph that says each of us has a worldview, and those worldviews influence the actions that we take in the world, whether we're conscious or unconscious of the worldview, or I like to say sometimes in our unawareness, they influence our actions, how we look at people, how we respond to them, how we respond to political events or other events. But as we act in the world, as Kathy said earlier, those actions and experiences influence our worldview. So my worldview as a grandfather is different than my worldview as a 10-year-old kid on the farm. I traveled and experienced the world, and so the notion of worldview is not linear. It is, in fact, always changing as we experience new things and learn new things. But we found that this idea resonated with people, but we also felt that people wanted to know more. What is my worldview? How can I really come to understand it and explore it? And so we began looking for a way to, in a very structured process, begin to understand our individual worldviews. And as Cassie said, we've come to understand that that same structured process can help us explore our organization's worldview, our profession's worldview, our social systems, and so on. So today we'll speak mostly from a personal sense, but the same structure applies in these other circumstances. When we wanted to find a way to essentially deconstruct our worldviews, we wanted a way that was, to find a way that was value neutral. In other words, it did not make assumptions up front about a particular worldview. And there were several, we came across several frameworks to begin to deconstruct worldviews, but many of them were in the religious literature or the scientific literature, and they assumed, for example, in religious literature that everyone had a belief in God. And framework made that assumption. In scientific literature, there were assumptions made about particular scientific views of the world. We came across the work of a philosopher in Belgium named Leo Apostel. And Leo Apostel passed away in 1995, so his work was completed prior to then, the work we're working with. And Apostel, who was a philosopher of science, saw that the world was becoming increasingly fragmented. And in that fragmentation, we were not communicating very well with each other. And in particular, he found the sciences not communicating very well with each other, whether you're a chemist or a physicist or a biologist or elsewhere. And he wanted to find a way to overcome this fragmentation. And he invited a group of people from around the world, from all kinds of disciplines, to come together to create a communications framework that would allow us to explore our personal worldview and someone else's worldview from a position of curiosity and exploration and not judgment. And that's the framework that we've been using and what we will outline today. So Apostel said that a worldview, and he created something called the Worldviews group, which no longer exists, but that was the people that came together. And they determined or outlined a framework that says our worldviews have 6 dimensions to them. And we're going to walk through each of those dimensions, and we're going to walk and explore them from the work that Kathy and I have done to expand and develop them. So the first dimension is reality. And the idea is that each of us has a sense of the reality of our lives, our world. And in this dimension, this is where we think of things like the beliefs we hold about life in the world. Is there a supreme being or not? How is man or person connected to nature? What do we think about beauty and ugliness and good and evil? So these are sort of meta views of the world, but it also describes how our individual worlds are structured and how we experience it. This is how we might describe our daily lives and the realities we experience. And those can be very different based on gender, based on color, based on language, based on cultural upbringing. And so each of us can have very different daily realities in our lives, and how we experience our world on that daily basis influences our worldview. So in this area, we invite a real exploration around personal realities, belief systems that influence our worldview, and daily experiences, and so on. The next dimension is explanation. For those of you that like philosophy, reality is really ontology, and explanation is the philosophical term. Another way to say it is history. And so this is that part where we explore how did our world come to be the way it is, and where does it come from? So here we begin to explore what have been the influences in our life that helped form how we see the world and how we sense and experience it. This is often an area where people really step into some very almost transformational explorations as they begin to list and explore what the influences in their lives and how those influences came to impact how they see the world. Whether it's family or friends or an experience that happened in the past or some way. This is also a chance to begin to explore why my world is the way it is and not different from the way it is. As I said, this exploration can become pretty transformational. The next dimension is the future. And this is our sense of where we are going. What is the future that's open to us? And what criteria might we use to select the future we want to have? There's also in here an element of time, meaning, do we think the future will be like the past? Do we value traditions substantially so that those traditions that are important to us will dramatically influence the future? Or are we very much sort of planning oriented? We're not so much thinking the future will be like the past, but the future will be different. And so we're always sort of looking out. Western culture in particular is strongly influenced by the notion of this planning, this forward looking. Or in fact, are we really sort of very much present oriented? There are many indigenous cultures that see past, present, and future alive in the moment. And so time has a different meaning for them in any sense of thinking about the future. We often find, and this is an area I can say personally where I've been challenged at times, because I by nature am a planner, and I like to really be thinking about out weeks and months in advance, and I get very frustrated with people that are very much traditionalists and saying, well, let's see what the past has to say for what we want to do now or in the future. And I've come to learn that how to work with these different perspectives and how they might clash. The next dimension is values, or axiology in a philosophical term. And this is where we begin to explore our personal belief about what is good or evil, what is valuable or not. So when we think of the term evaluation, the central word there is value. So when we're evaluating, we're putting a value on something. We like this, we didn't like it, this worked, this didn't work. But this also gets into the questions of, what do you consider happiness or suffering, beauty or ugliness? What do you believe about rights and privileges? So we can explore here things like, do we believe that people have dominion over nature? Or do we believe that people and nature coexist together in harmony? This is where we begin to explore what is the source of my moral guidelines. Where did they come from? Family, faith, society? Do we believe in absolute morality? And do we believe that there are certain, we like to say, capital T truths? And if there are, how strongly do we hold them? An example I often give is I might say that I believe that murder is wrong, but I remember when I was 18 years old and my grandfather was dying and completely bedridden and couldn't do nothing to take care of himself. He asked me, Jerry, on the farm, when an animal was in this condition, we could put that animal to sleep. Why can't we do that with humans? So it raises the question about how do I think about, is that murder or not murder? So often in our values, we explore what are core commitments, what are gray areas. This is often the area where people get in real conflict, is between different sets of values, and where we can begin to explore common ground and difference around values. The next dimension is practices. And these are, the ways that we act in the world, the practices that we choose to influence our lives and guide our lives, and how we want to behave and create in the world. So you can ask yourselves, what practices do I live my life by? Are my practices congruent or in alignment with my values? How do I treat other people? How do I treat myself? What beliefs do I hold about authority? Do I believe strongly that in systems of high authority and high hierarchy, or do I prefer more collaborative practices and systems? This is also an area where we can really see in practice whether a person is living their worldviews. One example we often give that we see people nodding their heads is someone may say that in my values, I believe in cooperation or collaboration, but in practice, they practice hierarchy. And so they may say one thing about their worldview, but in practice, they don't live what they say. So it's an area there to explore. And then the last dimension is knowledge. And this has two components to it. One is we're thinking about where does knowledge come from? How do you know what is true or false? What beliefs do you hold about reliable sources of knowledge? Do you believe in science or intuition or revelation? How much confidence do you place in scientific knowledge? In an organization, we did some work in one where they got all of their information from focus groups, and they began to realize that that might not be reliable knowledge. So it's a bit about how do you know what you know, but the other component to this is how do you know that the answers that you've just given to all 6 dimensions are true or correct? How do you know that how you've described your history is true? How do you know that these are your values? How do you know that science is a good way to gain knowledge? So it invites us to begin to check in on each of our sources of exploration. And so the same 6 dimensions can be used not only, as I've described, in a personal level, but what is my organization's reality or history or future? What about my profession? We've done work with a variety of different professions, and next week one of them will be law, but we've worked in medicine and pharmacy and so on to explore profession and professional worldviews. And then also in social systems. And social systems can be a culture, or it can be a community or something else. And often in social systems or cultures, everybody knows what the worldview might be, but it's not written down anywhere. So an example I might give is I lived in a small town for 17 years, and part of the worldview of that small town was if you weren't 3rd or 4th generation, you weren't from there, and you were never going to be from there. You were always from outside. So a community can have a social system or have a worldview as a social system, but cultures, whether you might be Lakota or Aboriginal or German or whatever, there are cultural worldviews and social systems. So I think I'll stop there and see where we might be. Kathy, are you going to go next, or are we just going to pause for some questions?
I think we could pause for some questions. One of the, we wanted to talk a tiny bit about the structure of the program when we deliver it, but now might be a good time just to pause for a second. You can take it off.
So we welcome either a verbal question or something in the chat box if you have a question.
And remember, for the verbal questions, to unmute your mic if indeed. In waiting, and I saw a question come up, Kathy and Jerry, is it more or less 80% of our worldview is unconscious? That was a question that came up earlier.
Thank you. Yes, that's generally a percentage that we use. There's been a fair amount of sort of psychological research on this notion of how aware we are. And it generally concludes that about 20% of what we do is in our conscious awareness, and about 80% is just in that world of habits and taken for granted. You know, we get up in the morning, we get dressed to go to work. We don't pause and ask, should I get dressed or not get dressed when I go to work? We may often find ourselves sitting in a car and somebody walks across the street and we create a whole story about them and we've never met them and don't know them. Where did that story come from? And so we quickly, when we teach this, we quickly do ladder of inference, where we begin to make assumptions about people and we don't really think about where they came from. And so it really is very much in our unawareness.
Marco asked, how do reality and practices differ?
So thank you for the question. So each of these 6 dimensions are not completely discrete. They interrelate with each other. So when we think about reality, it really is how we describe how things are in our life. It's how we experience our world and how we might describe it. The practices are the practices or actions we choose to bring our worldview alive into the world. So it's the choices I make about. So my reality is I live out in the countryside. My practice is I'm trying to be very environmentally. I practice environmentally sustainable things on my property in the countryside.
This is Rolf. Jerry, you mentioned the difference, the question, how do you know that the answers that you have given to all 6 dimensions are true or not? How can Worldview Intelligence help here?
So thank you, Rolf, and Kathy, if you want to step into. So first, with each of the dimensions, we have exercises that one can do to explore them in some depth, series of questions to explore and ask, and then in the program be in small group conversation with others. What happens is, because it's always our perception about what's true or not, is the exercises begin to open up at a deeper level our understanding of our history or our values. So we might say, I have some values, but we don't really think about them. I explore them, and then I begin to ask myself, are these really my values? Are they really true for me, or am I just, saying things that don't have depth and meaning to me? And we invite that exploration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add to that because we're not often thinking about these questions, just asking the question, why do I believe the way that I do? Why did I answer those questions the way that I did? Brings it to the forefront again. And one of the things that we differentiate between and talk about, or invite people to talk about, is the difference between opinions, facts, and beliefs. And one of the areas that we run into challenges in our conversations is when we think that we can prove our point by looking for data or by looking for facts. And what we are aware of and what we've been discovering is that those data arguments don't usually work very well, because the question isn't about data. We always say that you give me your set of data and I'll go find my set of data, so that we're each just trying to prove our own point. The conversation actually is often somewhere else. It's either a way I'm thinking about the future conversation, or it's a values conversation, or it's something in our history that is causing us to be in conflict. And so just asking the questions, how do I know what I know, invites us to be in an exploration that is more complete or more expansive than if we're not asking the question at all.
Kathy, Jerry, Bertrand has come up with a really probing question. What may be the effect of our disconstructing worldview for an individual or a group? And I'll copy it here so it's in the bottom of the list.
Good question.
Well, I can start. There's a couple of effects for deconstructing it. So one is, we know that when people have an understanding of the 6 dimensions, we've been told by people that it's a very intuitive framework to be able to use. And so being able to be in an inquiry in each of these different dimensions enables us to understand the complexity either of ourselves and our own point of view, or the organization or the system that we're working in. There's 2 impacts of that. One is it's good for understanding. The other is that it's good for strategizing what a different relationship or a different communication could look like, because I'm now thinking about it differently than I was before. And the other question, or the other part of it, is when we begin to think about a future, we can be more intentional about the future that we're aspiring to, and build in the practices that support the future that we're looking for.
Thanks, Kathy. Just to add a couple other things to that. So as Kathy spoke earlier, when our worldview is challenged, we have a tendency to react in 2 ways. One is to hold more strongly on our worldview, and secondly, to react as if our life or mortality is challenged. So in deconstructing our worldview, our personal worldview, we can begin to explore, why am I reacting this way to this situation or this challenge? What is it a challenge to personal values? Is there something in my history? Is there something in my personal practices? So there's an element here of know thyself that becomes really important, and this becomes a structured way to know thyself. The same structure then can be used to understand another person's worldview. So we may be talking about the same thing and see them very differently from a personal values perspective. So at a personal level, it really helps us to know why we are reacting the way we are to various different circumstances, positively or negatively. I want to emphasize here that the program and the learning is not about what's a right worldview or a wrong worldview, and it's not about changing someone's worldview. It's about that personal self-awareness of what my worldview is. From there, I can make choices about whether I want to shift or expand my worldview or not. The same thing happens with a company or a group. I'll give you a very quick example of a company Kathy and I are working with. Is the company it's big with 30,000 employees. They have 3 different main campuses, and the campuses have different worldviews. One is ready, shoot, aim. In other words, we'll make a decision and deal with the consequences later. Another campus has historically been ready, aim, aim, aim. What were we aiming at? So it took forever to make a decision. That internal awareness of those different worldviews became quite conflictual when the 2 campuses had to collaborate. And then in addition, they're in different towns with very different local social system worldviews that we could make explicit. that opened up the possibility to move away from conflict and into awareness of why this conflict exists, what its source is, and how can we find ways to work on those things that matter to us through our more explicit understanding of how we're each seeing the world as organizations or individuals. So I hope that gets to Bertrand's question.
Yeah. And I would just add one more thing to that, which is that the structure and the language of the framework enables people to explore challenges that have sometimes been in existence for quite a long time, but it elicits new insights for them as they think about the different components of the structure.
And I see there, yes, Mary Ellen, it is about relationships, very much.
And there was a question earlier, is it the case that asking the question brings a degree of agency, more responsible? And I'm putting that at the bottom of the list.
I would say yes. I think, you know, that own awareness helps us, you know, to act more thoughtfully and, you know, more intentionally. So we're less controlled by things that are not in our awareness. By bringing them forward, we're making choices from a position of awareness and understanding. Sorry, Kathy, did you want to add to that?
Nope, that's good.
So Kathy and Jerry, maybe you could say a few words about the November program.
Oops. We could. Yes, absolutely. One of the things that is exciting and interesting about the programs as we think about them and as we deliver them, and it's the variety and nature of explorations that people get to be in. You know, like many other programs like this, there is the opportunity for people to bring in very specific questions and issues and challenges that they might be dealing with or wanting to deal with. And the format of the program is that we offer some teaching around worldview, the framework, and some other components that are making up the whole of the program. There's an opportunity for self-reflection, for small group discussion, which is where many of the insights arise for people, and then full group debrief. There's a personal exploration, usually in the program, an organizational exploration and a social systems exploration. In the social systems piece, people get to map out the social systems of interest that they're working with. And the big thing is the opportunity to really begin to think about what some other worldviews might be. So organizationally, if we're working with another organization or we're working with the departments within an organization, it's an opportunity to think about what the worldview of a different department might be, to strategize the relationship or the communication differently now that I'm thinking about them differently through that worldview lens. There's a systems thinking component in it. There is some practices and tools that people get introduced to that they could become part of a personal practice around working with different worldviews and working on things that are of importance to them. I'll stop there and let Jerry pick that up.
I just wanted to mention there's a program in October in Minneapolis and then one in November in Frankfurt. I was thinking a little bit about Holger's question here, Kathy, when you were speaking too. And maybe I just want to speak to that a moment, because I think some of us, particularly that work with families that have been in multi-generations of a kind of work, let's say farming or mining, forestry or something, as Kathy said, our identity gets wrapped up very strongly in our worldview. So by making explicit, for example, that I'm a fourth generation miner, That's all my family has known for many generations is mining, or maybe it's farming, or it's something else. I can make that explicit. That doesn't mean that I want to change from mining, even though the industry may be struggling. But by making that explicit, it also makes more clear questions that might be asked. So in Minnesota, we have a mining industry that's declining, and people come and say, well, just move and take a new job. And that's not so easy, and I might not be so willing to change when my identity is so tied to my history, my family, my whole life. And so I think what helps here is making those senses of self explicit can change the nature of the conversation, because we make just assumptions about, oh, it's easy to do this and easy to do that. It's not so easy when who you are is tied to your worldview, your personal identity.
I did one more, it's a different, kind of a different response, but thinking about situations where you have very different worldviews from somebody else. It can offer us that opportunity to pause, to think about someone else's worldview, and to think about our own worldview, and to find those places where worldviews are aligned. I think that in some situations that can help us change the nature of the relationship. In other situations, that can help us accept the nature of the relationship. And I think about it more in from a personal place in that respect, because I think about my 83-year-old father, who has some very definitive worldview perspectives that are very different from mine. And I'm not in a place of needing to convince him to change his worldview or persuade him to see the world from my worldview, but we can just rest on those points of connection that we have between us, and I can let the rest of it go. And so just my awareness can change the nature of our relationship, because I have greater peace with that relationship than I might have had before or in the past. So I think that the worldview exploration opens up to us conscious choice about how we want to engage a relationship or an organization or a system, and come to peace with whatever that choice is, but it becomes intentional choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I see some wonderful comments being posted. Very true in them.
The other thing I would mention, if you haven't already discovered it, is we have the Worldview Intelligence website, which I said is pretty basic in form, but we are continuing to put stories up there and examples up there about where we've been using this work. And we have some videos and some video testimonials from people who were just through the program in Halifax that helps bring it alive a little bit more. And by the time we do these next two programs in October and November, we will have had more client experiences. Next week, actually, we're working here in Nova Scotia with the Nova Scotia Barristers Society, using Worldview Intelligence to support a culture shift in the way they're regulating the practice of law here in Nova Scotia, which is leading edge for around the world.
And I'm sorry.
Yeah, Nancy speaking here. I just wanted to suggest to everyone there's a lot of literature, and I just want to share with you an article that I read recently that really impacted, because it illustrated beautifully what Kathy and Mary have said here. And it's about around abortion and pro-lifers coming face to face with pro-choice. And, until someone steps in and had them look at the differences in worldviews, they were they were at each other's throats. Exaggerating, but really, really at odds with each other. And stepping back to look at the foundation of the different worldviews among the two groups, it just allowed them, as someone said earlier, to look at the relationship and say, okay, I see. So it was, again, doing this explicit act of putting forth the worldviews that had them just be a little bit more curious about where the other people were coming from. And I would be happy to send you the link to the article along with the harvesting and the reporting and everything else we'll be sending you about this forum.
Just to build on that, Nancy, one thing that was powerful about the piece was, and for our practices as hosts or facilitators or just in our families and lives, is neither side was asked to change their worldview on the issue, but both could begin to see the humanity in the other person. So they began to see where their values were aligned and where the choices based on those values were different. But they saw each other not as adversaries completely and enemies completely, or sometimes we say the other, but the humanity in each other. And I think that's what becomes important here.
Yeah. Any other questions among our listeners? Well, and if not, maybe we can move towards a checkout, different kind of checkout, but that will allow everyone to come through. And our checkout question is, what is alive for you now? At the end of this forum, what's in your belly right now? So we're going to invite everyone once again to put that in your chat box, and we will put it in the harvesting.
I see the comments about curiosity and judgment, and we always say that curiosity and judgment cannot exist in the same space. So when we notice ourselves being judgmental or dismissive or defensive, it's a really good point to turn on curiosity to understand our own reaction and to be curious about the other person or the situation.
Thank you very much for your contribution, for your questions, also for the help with the harvesting, especially to Holger and Mary Ellen. And it was very fruitful for 1 hour. Thank you very much for your participation. I hope we will see you again.
And we'll be getting back to you with the harvest.
That's great.
Bye-bye. Thanks all.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.